Vulnerable peasants were physically tortured to pay up, and when they didn't have
Whoa,
the means to pay,
damn.
the British confiscated their farmland for themselves. Tens of millions of landless peasants were created for the first time in Indian history.
Holy. Ew, that's nasty. Ugh, that's ugh. How Britain made India poor. Well, there was no India at this period of time, but
in the year 1700, India's share in the world's economy was an astounding 27%, more than all of Europe combined. 250.
Yeah, that was the Indian subcontinent, though. India was a country, but later, the video just started.
India's share had dropped to less than 3%, and its people were left impoverished. What happened? Strap in, adventurers. We're about to dive into a dark and messy history. Welcome to 18th century India. In 1707 CE, the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb sends the empire into a decades-long spiral. In his wake, an endless parade of weak princelings forced themselves upon the peacock throne. With the Mughal Empire teetering on the brink of collapse, regional powers jostle for supremacy. Land grabs and title claims, infighting and betrayal. India is vulnerable. The situation.
I mean, the Mughal Empire, I don't really consider the Mughal Empire to be India, though. I mean, Mughal just means Mongol. So we're saying that Mongols are Indians now?
The situation is so precarious that in 1739, Persian Emperor Nadir Shah invades North India and sacks Delhi. During this period of disorder, the British sensed opportunity. Leveraging their unique advantages as a foreign power, they bribed and blasted their way into a dominant position in the subcontinent. India was no stranger.
Yeah. And that's the thing is, I see a lot of Indians, like, always say, like, Ma, if only we were united against Britain, Ma. That's unrealistic. That's so unrealistic, and here's why. To give you a simple analogy for you to understand what I mean by that is, it's like saying, oh, the dictator of Germany could have won World War II if you insert something that completely changes his personality. And the thing with the India subcontinent, and I'm not going to say India because there was no India at this point in time anyways, the Indian subcontinent was, they didn't really care about each other. There was no Indian identity or none of that, right? They only cared about themselves and what was in their interests. So, you know, you can't really change that personality, right? That's how they were able to be bribed. A lot of India being colonized by Britain was just Britain bribing and just paying Indian princely states off. So, in fact, when Britain actually left India, decolonized India, a lot of people actually thought that India would kind of, like British Raj, it was called, not even India, but a lot of people just thought British Raj would kind of like balkanize and just break apart because, well, the British was gone. There was no need for these princely states to be all together because the princely states were still there. They were all just basically vassals of the crown, just all clumped together as one. And now that the crown had left, you know, they weren't vassals of the crown anymore. So people just thought that they would just become their own independent thing, which kind of happened. It kind of happened, but the Indian government kind of stopped that from happening before it like really got too bad. So a lot of people tend to overlook that about India, especially Indians. Whenever I see them like saying like, "Oh, my Britain colonized India," no, so bad. Like, dude, it was your Indian ancestors somewhat that even allowed that colonization to even happen in the first place, right? It's like whenever people in my comments like to bring up slavery, it's like, dude, it's the Africans who allowed the slave. Like, you say what you want, but the Africans were the one who allowed this to happen, right? We could use the same logic with India. India kind of just more or less allowed themselves to get colonized.
Danger to dealing with foreign aggression. But the British were not like those who had come before. No. They were not like Nadir Shah, who looted and simply left. Nor were they like the Huns, who, while shedding Gupta blood, became Indian themselves. Yes, the British were different, for they saw India as an inexhaustible gold mine whose resources were to be forever extracted. By the time India won its independence in 1947, its native institutions had been demolished, its economy de-industrialized, its trade networks severed, and its people more deeply divided by caste and creed. In just 200
I mean, India was always divided. Like, again, that's why India was even colonized in the first place. It was because of said divide that it was able to. Also, regarding the whole trade, how was okay? The video is a minute long. Let's give them time to explain themselves. But I don't know. I'm seeing a kind of inaccurate stuff here. Let's
100 years of colonial rule, the India that once inspired the world was unmade. The halcyon days of India are over. She has been drained of all the wealth she once possessed, and her energies have been cramped by a sordid system of misrule. The deliberate bleeding of India by the British was so extreme that famed American scholar Will Durant referred to it as the greatest crime in all of history. So let's pull back the curtain and see what India was like before colonialism. In the 19th century, the American J.T. Sunderland wrote about the India that the British found when they arrived. India was a far greater industrial...
An American source. Not like I would rather hear from an Indian source than an American source. Because America has this thing where it loves to bash any and everything from Britain and the British Empire. So I already trust this source really
and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or Asia. Her textile goods were famous all over the civilized world. So was her exquisite jewelry and her precious stones. So was her pottery, her porcelains and ceramics. So were her fine works in metal, iron, steel, silver, and gold. She had great architecture, equal in beauty to any in the world. She had great merchants, businessmen, bankers, and financiers. She was not only a great shipbuilding nation, but had commerce and trade which extended to all civilized countries. That may seem like heavy-handed praise, but the record does show that pre-colonial India was a dominant manufacturing economy. Let's take a closer look at the textile, shipbuilding, and metalworking industries. India was a textile superpower for most of its long history. There were many textile centers in the subcontinent. Coastal Andhra was a block printing hub, for example, while Gujarat and Bengal were known for their high-end woven products. There was global demand for these items. In fact, India enjoyed a mind-blowing 25% share of the global textile trade by the mid-18th century. This thriving textile trade had knock-on effects for the entire economy. For example, the popularity of Indian textiles led to the creation of stable international distribution networks. By piggybacking on these networks, other Indian artisans could sell their goods worldwide at a reduced cost. As a result, many different industries flourished alongside the Indian textile industry.
Yes. But what was life like for the average Indian person? The average Indian person was more or less still poor. And this is the same pattern with a lot of these countries. It doesn't matter what country. It's like, oh yeah, this country's economy was flourishing. Cool. But where's most of that economy even going to? That's the question you have to ask. Right? Look at America, for example. One would look and be like, oh my goodness, America's economy is flourishing. But where's most of that economy going to? Where's most of that money going to? Right? It's not going to vast majority of Americans. Nope. It's going to the 1%. The 1% legitimately owns vast majority of the economy in America. So on paper, it's like, woo! The American economy is growing. But then when you dig deeper, it's like, oh, wait. It's just the 1% that's just benefiting from it. So, I mean, this video just kind of seems surface level. And like I said, there was no India in the 18th century. No. No, hell no. And there is no Indian identity, like nationality or any of that. No. Hilariously enough, it was Britain who more or less would create India and even like give that whole Indian identity. Like not create, but unite India into, well, India.
We know that international trade was conducted primarily along maritime routes, and so the Indian shipbuilding industry had developed into a behemoth too. A significant number of Indian ports were engaged in the shipbuilding industry: Dhaka, Masulipatam, Surat, Calicut, Quilon, and many, many others. Entire rural communities were involved in the production and processing of materials used to construct ships. Quality was paramount. Consider the Bengali merchant fleet in the early 17th century. The fleet consisted of nearly 5,000 ships, each capable of carrying up to...
Bangladesh isn't even a part of India, and Bangladesh was a part of Pakistan, right? Bangladesh fought a whole independence war to be free from Pakistan, which India had to liberate Bangladesh pretty much from Pakistani oppression, if I remember that correctly. 96,000 Pakistani troops instantly surrendered, if I remember that correctly, as soon as India got into that Bengal War of Independence, right? And I'm saying this because I'm still pointing out how even when Britain decolonized India, the Indian subcontinent still had clear problems. Like clear problems, right? So keep that in mind.
500 tons of goods. These ships were constructed in Bengali ports by native artisans who had the skills to craft elaborate wood, iron, and brass fittings. According to one British maritime observer, Indian vessels combine elegance and utility and are models of fine workmanship. Merchant contracts indicate that Bengali ships were much more durable than English ships. Bengali ships had an average lifespan exceeding 20 years, while English ships were not known to last more than 12. Quite a difference. India was a longtime pioneer in the global...
What is the point in mentioning that fact? What is... Okay, like... What is the point? I mean, this video just kind of seems more or less like someone who just has an agenda. It's like whenever I watch those like Afrocentric like videos and they'll like cherry pick like the worst, like, I mean, like cherry pick to the teeth, man. Like European colonization of Africa or something relating to slavery, or this is the vibe that I'm getting from this video. So I'm gonna play devil's advocate here and just say maybe he's just showing us how great the Indian subcontinent was before Britain colonized, right? I think so, but it's not the vibe that I'm getting from this.
Steel industry.
At IHG Hotel.
As early as the 6th century CE, crucible-formed steel, which came to be known as Wootz or Damascus steel in the West, was being produced for export by Indian blacksmiths, particularly along the Malabar coast and in the Deccan. Arab and European officers regularly imported blades from India, while these blades were purchased as war...
The Indian subcontinent, not India. There was no India, especially in the 6th century. Hell no. No. And this is why I really and truly can't subscribe to a lot of what this video is saying. What he's saying is true, but he's saying India. There was no freaking India at this period of time. There was no India identity, none of that. The Indian subcontinent is big. Big. He's over generalizing on purpose, and it's annoying. That is that is an intellectual insult, because you have people who don't know much about history watching this video, and now they're going to watch this video, and I'm pretty sure he's purposely doing this on purpose. But people are going to go and take this info, and they're unironically going to use that info wherever the hell they go with that info, right? The point is, this is ill information. This is low-key misinformation. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. Like,
wartime implements, they were so robust and beautifully crafted that they also served as a mark of high status in times of peace. Though we've barely scratched the surface, it should already be clear that India was a manufacturing juggernaut, a thriving exporter of high-quality goods to markets throughout the world. How did the British manage to unmake all of that? The fundamental principle of the British has been to make the whole Indian nation subservient to the interests and benefits of themselves.
And you're quoting one guy. Not only is he quoting a guy, he's quoting an American. Dude. An American? You know how many Americans I get in my comments, especially whenever I react to anything bad about America or call out America on their BS? You know how many Americans I get in my comments who are like, Britain did this, Britain did that, Britain did that. Like, Americans are so hellbent on just, like, they'll call out any and everything except for America. Like, they're so hellbent on that. And they do it to Russia, too. Like, they'll call out any and everything that Russia does. I guess they're doing it now to Russia because Russia is now the main adversary of America, right? Back then, it was Britain, right? So, you know, America would be focused more on Britain. But now Britain, yeah, British Empire is gone. So now they're doing it to Russia, right? It's hilarious, bro. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm hearing him out, but the moment I hear American and criticizing the British Empire, low-key, my ears low-key close. Because America's, when it comes to the British Empire, Americans usually are never objective. They're usually just super emotional and just loves bashing the British Empire. And they do this with Russia too. It's absolutely absurd. I don't know why they're like this, but it's so absurd. And then you call out any and everything that America has done, you know, like ethnically cleansing 90% of the Native Americans, you know, manifest destiny, right? But technically genocide, when you really and truly, by definition, genocide, there's no critique there. I mean, you're writing about India. Why don't you write about how America purposely, and you can literally go look this, America purposely wiped out most of the Native Americans on what's now the United States of America. They either forced them to assimilate or they just forcefully wiped them out into small, insignificant communities. Don't dare come in my comments and say, but Indian reservations, bro. Those tiny ass native man, get out of here with that. Do you really think those natives would want to be stuck on those tiny reservations? Like, get out of here with that, man. Why don't you go talk about that?
And so, once the British took power, they changed the entire dynamic of the Indian economy to suit their own interests. The first step, dismantling all native industry. To start, they established a legal monopoly over Indian textile goods and cut off the export market, which immediately disrupted long-standing trade links.
Oh my gosh, dude. Yes, I literally explained this on my American Revolutionary War video. Britain was a trade empire. Britain was an empire built on trade. This was the only way for the British Empire to get profit. Every single colony was like this. Every single colony was like this. They were required to trade only with Britain. That was literally the only way for Britain to get profit. Plain and simple. This was not unique to India. And if you watch my American Revolutionary War by Epic History TV video, you'd hear me talk about this is why many of the American founding fathers wanted independence because they were smugglers and they wanted more profits. Plain and simple.
Having now made themselves the exclusive buyers of Indian textiles, the British then changed the way that they paid for those goods. Instead of using foreign currency, they paid using the tax revenues extracted from India. The Indian economy stagnated and prices collapsed. Skilled artisans who once...
Again, you're saying the India economy. How do you even measure the Indian economy? Where? What are the stats? How can you measure an economy where there was no country of India? I mean, you could measure the subcontinent, I guess. Like all the princely states that were now basically vassals of the British crown. Like, you know, you could cry, complain, do what you want. But at the end of the day, a lot of these princely states were willfully joined. Like, some of them were conquered, yes. But a lot of these princely states invited the British in at the end of the day, right? They invited the British in. Some were conquered, yes, but a lot of them, too many of them, really and truly, invited the British in. Like, you can say what you want, but that's still on them. That's still on your ancestors somewhat. Again, repeating myself from the start of the video, this is why when Britain decolonized India, many people thought that India would just be balkanized. Because now that Britain was gone, there was no reason for these princely states to all be together as one whole thing. Because the whole thing that was holding them together in the first place was Britain. So now that Britain was gone, now that Britain didn't care about India anymore, was too busy decolonizing, there was no agreement or deal for anything anymore. All that stuff was just thrown out the window, quite literally. Let's continue.
Fueled the vibrant Indian economic engine, were now significantly poorer and more restricted than ever before. And it didn't stop there. Soon enough, British manufacturers lobbied their government to completely eliminate the competition from the Indian textile industry. See, despite the restrictions imposed on Indian industry, British manufacturers were still finding it difficult to compete with Indian products. Company soldiers were sent to smash Indian looms. According to several different accounts, they even went around breaking the thumbs of weavers so that they could no longer ply their trade. But that's not all. To ensure...
Okay. Now this is something where, like, I can't really like defend that. That's just cruel. That's just quite cruel right there. The only thing that I can say is, I mean, yeah, that's capitalism for you. That's capitalism, right? Capitalism, this is what capitalism gives you. And you know what I find hilarious about Americans that love to bash the British Empire, right? Is these are the same Americans who will be so hell-bent on defending capitalism. But this is what capitalism gives you. Now, I'm not a communist, but I would lean more towards that. Because capitalism has been cruel. Really cruel. I would argue that capitalism is more cruel than communism. You could quote me on that. I don't care. I could go on and on and on about all the things that were caused because of capitalism.
Ensure that the Indian...
And this is simply just a product of that. Listen to what he said. The lobbyists, the British rich people, elite class, whatever you want to call them, what do they want? Profit. That's capitalism. What is capitalism? Profit, 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 profit. That's capitalism, buddy. I swear. So, you want to get angry at that? Get angry at capitalism. Stop saying British. Like, dude, most British people weren't even benefiting from colonialism.
The Indian textile industry could not recover, adapt, or innovate itself back into relevancy. The British imposed an absurdly harsh 80% tariff. This had an immediate catch-22 trap effect. Exporting goods from India to the UK was now economically unviable. But remember, Indians were restricted from selling to anyone else. Similar restrictions were imposed on nearly every branch of manufacturing in India. India was reduced to being a mere exporter of raw materials, like cotton and metal ore. so that the British could sell finished products back to Indians at a premium. We conquered India as an outlet for the goods of Britain. I'm not such a hypocrite to say that we hold India for the Indians. The colonial de-industrialization process was so complete that by 1947, only 0.7% of India was employed in any form of manufacturing. But skilled workers had to go somewhere, do something. The British monopoly on industrial production drove Indian artisans, merchants, builders, and others into agriculture en masse. In the words of Dr. Charles Hall, India's population has been thrown back upon the soil because Britain's discriminating duties have ruined every branch of native manufacture. Rural wages cratered to historical lows, and in fact, the land itself could not sustain the influx of newly disenfranchised workers. Poor seasonal harvests and droughts gave way to catastrophic famines and mass poverty. With most Indians now converted into peasant cultivators, the British sought to exploit them further. They began to tax cultivators as the primary revenue source for the administration. Taxes were extreme, pegged at 50 to 80% of gross income, and calculated before the harvest. The result? Indian cultivators often owed more in taxes than they earned as income. The British knew how harsh this really was. They openly conceded that they were imposing the highest tax rates in the world, and that taxes were more than 3 times higher than they had ever been under Indian rulers. To add insult to injury, the British even bragged about it in Parliament. The Indians have been taxed to the utmost limit. Every province has been made a field for higher exaction, and it has always been our boast how greatly we have raised the revenue above that which the native rulers were able to extort.
First of all, I mean, yeah, this is quite sad. I mean, this is basically this is basically like chattel slavery. And Karen, this is pretty much similar. But bro, I mean, like you said, dude, I'm not saying I'm not saying to not blame Britain for this. Oh, you should. Definitely. Go blame those elite class. I mean, you want to know what's funny is those elites still exist today. Yeah. Don't blame them for that. The only issue that I have is when people start blaming, like, the entire British population, right? Even now, to this day. Now, if you're there blaming, like, the royal family, yeah, go bash them. You could do that. And this is coming from someone who is a big monarchist for the royal family. The royal family deserves shade, 100%, because they were like the main components of all this, right? This is like they were the ones getting all this wealth, 100%. Yeah, go bash them. But what I hate about this is when people bash all British people. Even people who had absolutely nothing to do with this. That's what I hate. Or they just ignore the fact that this is even possible because, again, of the native Indian rulers who made this possible for Britain.
Colonial taxes were so burdensome that 2/3 of the population in directly ruled British areas fled to the hinterlands, where native Indian lords could at least minimally protect them from financial depredation. The millions who stayed behind could hardly afford to pay taxes, and the situation was worsened by the fact that the British did not negotiate tax payments. Horrors were perpetrated under the guise of sinless mathematical neutrality. Tax defaulters were confined in cages and exposed to the burning sun. Fathers sold their children to meet the rising rates.
Damn! That is wild!
Vulnerable peasants were physically tortured to pay up, and when they didn't have
Whoa,
the means to pay,
damn!
the British confiscated their farmland for themselves. Tens of millions of landless peasants were created for the first time in Indian history.
Holy... Ew, that's nasty. Ugh, that's ugh.
By the end of the 19th century, India was Britain's largest source of revenue by far, its largest purchaser of exports, and a source of highly paid employment for both British civil servants and soldiers, and they were all paid for by Indian taxes. Many British officials freely acknowledged the exploitative nature of the colonial enterprise. In fact, a Prime Minister of the UK, the Marquess of Salisbury, himself admitted, "As India is to be bled of money, the lancet should be directed to those parts where the blood is congested." And just like that, India and its people were bled dry. The fundamental issue of British overlordship was the fact that the British had no intention to become one with the land or to rule it as their own. The British saw—
I mean, still though, even before British rule, I mean, this is horrible. This is horrible. But I mean, like, the average Indian was still poor before British rule, right? It's just that Britain just more or less deassembled the elite class of India, except for the princely rulers, pretty much, right? Really and truly, again, that's just capitalism. Even now today, in America or the West, right? There are plenty of companies that would love to slave you away. Love to do this, but they can't because there's legal restrictions. But we all know that companies do any and everything to circumvent that, to bypass that, right? That's just that's why I said this is all just pure capitalism. I'm listening to this and I'm like, well, yeah. When you have a capitalist country, this is what you get. Plain and simple. Even in America, look at America. America's like hyper capitalist, right? But the average American life sucks. Like, Americans are so poor. They're so broke. They're basically in debt with everything, right? It's astounding, right? All I'm saying is, this is not uniquely a British thing. I mean, this here was only even allowed because times were different. It's like with slavery, like chattel slavery. Chattel slavery was more or less a product of capitalism. At least the transatlantic trade one. And that was only able to be possible because times were different back then. People were ignorant, and like enlightenment and all that stuff wasn't really like there yet, right? To, you know, make people realize, hey, this is wrong, right? Ideals were different. All that was different. So that stuff was able to happen because, you know, they could have just gotten away with it, plain and simple. But that's still capitalism, more or less. Capitalism merely just evolved. That's a good way to put it. Capitalism simply evolved, right? It evolved from being able to just be cruel outright to companies, CEOs, and whatnot needing to restrict. And even then, it's like, that's not the case because still in Southeast Asia, we have loads of people in Southeast Asia today who are getting paid dirt money to make our clothes, our shoes, especially these luxury brand items. We got children getting paid pennies. Nobody talks about that, right? So the same thing that's going on here, it's honestly, it's kind of still here. We got people in the Congo, in the mines, basically slaves, mining raw materials and sending it off to Western countries. Same thing. I mean, it's like, you know, I'm saying all this because like, this video is true, but I'm saying this is not a uniquely Indian thing. This is just capitalism, plain and straight. And really and truly, if companies had the chance to bring back something like this today, like in Western countries, they sure as hell would. Where they don't need to pay people as much and they get profits by any means necessary. They're only restricted. That's why they can't do that now. But I'm telling you, bro, these companies would love to go back in time and have this coming. Or should I better say going on? And even now, a lot of these companies still have it going on in Southeast Asia, right? So, I mean, say what you want, complain what you want, but a lot of the clothes that you have, especially if you live in the West, I guarantee you that some basic, more or less slave made that. your shoes, your items. I'm telling you, you have so many items here that were made by some dirt poor person who was getting paid pennies per day, bro. Plain and simple. Plain and simple. I mean, the phone that you have, the laptop that you have, the gaming PC that you have, you know where those minerals come from to make those components? Basic slaves in Central Africa. Plain and simple. Let's continue.
India is innately and eternally foreign, and this justified their creation and maintenance of what scholars have referred to as an extractive colony. For comparison's sake, consider the Turkic peoples who invaded India and eventually formed the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. Look, the Mughals were no heroes. They imposed unequal taxes, engaged in religious discrimination, plundered local treasuries, visited great violence upon their enemies, and exhibited a Persianized racial arrogance. But one thing is clear: India's wealth was preserved at a foundational level. After nearly 2 centuries.
Yes, because they were benefiting from it. They ruled the Indian subcontinent, so of course they benefited from it. The Mughals, bro, it's common sense. India's wealth was preserved because this was all that the Mughals ruled. Britain is all the way thousands of miles away from India, so guess what? That wealth is going from India to Britain. But these people who are ruling the Indian subcontinent, well, that's where they are. Like, oh my gosh, dude. Like, duh. This should be common sense, right? If the Mughals, right? Let's say if the Mughals somehow were based in Mongolia still, right? And they were ruling India from Mongolia. India's wealth would be siphoned to Mongolia, right? Where they're based in, right? But the Mughals were based in the Indian subcontinent, so the wealth is going to stay in the Indian subcontinent. There's no need to transfer it. Simple. Because they're ruling the subcontinent for themselves. So of course the wealth isn't going to go anywhere. Why would you want to transfer the wealth? Oh my goodness, dude.
Centuries of Mughal rule, India was still a dominant economic power, responsible for 27% of global trade. There's a simple reason for that. See, the Mughals had a foreign place of origin, Fergana, but they did not repatriate India's resources to their original homeland. India may not
Okay, so you basically just explain what I said.
have been Fergana, but it had become their new home, and so their loyalties and energies were owed solely to India.
Okay, yeah, that's literally just what I said. Like, so I you can't even use the Mongols as an example. It's like they just so happen to just use India as their new home. But if they chose not to do that, India's wealth would be siphoned, really and truly.
Meanwhile, the British ruled India as disconnected tyrants. The bulk of the revenue from India wasn't reinvested in India. No. It wasn't reinvested in India. No. It was extracted.
Wait, hold on a second. I gotta replay this.
Meanwhile, the British ruled India as disconnected tyrants. The bulk of the revenue from India wasn't reinvested in India. No. It was extracted and repatriated to their distant, foggy homeland. How much? Modern economists have estimated that the total amount of wealth that the British extracted.
Before he says that, because I know what he's gonna say anyways. I mean, yeah. Any empire who controlled India would have done the same thing. This is not a uniquely British thing. You can quote me on that. The only reason why every single other empire didn't do that was because they were based in India. That is simple. That's literally why India's wealth wasn't siphoned. That's why India's wealth was able to stay on the Indian subcontinent. Because every single empire that conquered India just stayed in India. Right? They reinvested in India because they were the ones who controlled India. It was their empire. It was their kingdom, their realm, their country. So of course they would do that. Especially when much of their empire was pretty much 90% of their empire pretty much the India subcontinent, of course they're gonna reinvest into their empire. I mean, Britain did the same thing, except that Britain wasn't based in India. Britain was based in Britannia, so they reinvested that into Britannia. But yeah. So what are you saying with the whole, like, he's trying to portray this as like Britain bad, Britain bad, Britain bad, but no, like, no. This is a case of, if it wasn't Britain, it would have been somebody else. Plain and simple. This is not a uniquely British thing. No. Like, if Britain, for example, let's say just create a wild alternate history. Let's say, I don't know, Britain just moves to India, right? Like, move all the government to India, right? And now the British government is based and sat in India or whatever. Now Britain doesn't need to move the wealth from India anymore. It can just keep the wealth there. And obviously it's going to reinvest that wealth into, well, where the government is seated. Duh.
From India is in the ballpark of $43 trillion.
Are you really the last?
Okay. This has been more or less debunked. I don't really feel like debunking this. You can go check out other people who debunked this by now. Like, in a nutshell, this is over the course of India's colonization. This wasn't like, and there's so many different metrics that came to this number. Like, I don't even feel talking about that, because I've debated this with so many people in the past that I don't even feel talking about that. Let's continue.
$43 trillion. When taxes are...
Although a lot of the money, a lot of the wealth was transferred from India. So it's definitely a lot. I definitely do believe that it was like good couple of $1 trillion. I do believe so. But 43 trillion, a lot of that money wasn't, no.
Not spent in the country from which they are raised. They constitute an absolute loss and extinction of the whole amount withdrawn from the taxed country. The money might as well be thrown into the sea. Such is the nature of the tribute we have so long exacted from India. Apologists for colonial rule often point to the railways as some sort of extravagant counter to the argument of extraction and divestment. But as modern scholars have pointed out, the railways serve as evidence for how exploitative and inefficient British investment in India really was. First, there's the bold assumption that Indians would not have built railways, like the Japanese or others, either by importing the technology or by developing their own. India had been far too advanced and cutting edge of civilization to not keep up had it been given the opportunity to do so. When the British came to India, the country was the leader of Asiatic civilization. Japan was nowhere. Now, in 50 years, Japan has revolutionized her history with the aid of modern arts of progress, and India, burdened by 150 years of English rule, is condemned to tutelage. But let's ignore that for now. Initially, the Indian railways were positioned as a grand investment scheme for British shareholders. The government guaranteed substantial returns of at least 5% per year, and when the revenues were not enough to pay out these returns, Indian taxpayers covered all the losses. Because of these taxpayer-backed guarantees, construction of the railways was extremely inefficient. Here's a fun stat. Every mile of Indian rail cost £18,000 to construct, as compared to £2,000 for the same mile built in the United States. All the elements of railway construction, steel, wagons, gears, engines, and more, were produced by British manufacturers. Indians weren't even given an opportunity to produce their own manufactured alternatives, because the British government imposed restrictions that prevented Indians from competing. Worse still, the essential purpose of the railways was to assist the British enterprise in the exploitation of the natural resources of India. In fact, the railways made it possible for the British to export enormous amounts of grain and other agricultural products, which sparked and exacerbated famines. Over the course of British rule in India, an estimated 35 million preventable deaths were caused by famines. That's millions more than those killed under Stalin or Mao. And that's
oh my gosh. Is he gonna talk about the whole like famine that happened during World War II? No, before I even talk about that, I don't know who the hell says that Britain brought railways to India. That's such a dumb argument. Like, what? I see people who say that. I'm like, people unironically argue that, like, railroads, bro.
5 times more than the Holocaust. The British were directly responsible for this. They mass exported Indian foodstuffs to Britain and other countries in Europe, even during drought periods. Food in India became too expensive for peasants to afford. According to Dr. Charles Hall, India starves so that its annual tax revenue to England may not be diminished by $1. There is plenty of grain in India.
But what type of famines are we talking about here? He's not going in detail. Like, the main one that I see Indians like to bring up would be the one that happened during World War II. And it's like, bro, you are trying to bring up wartime conditions, really, to try and justify how Britain was bad? Like, and also, a lot of the famine that happened during World War II could be attributed to the fact that the Japanese, like, not just the Japanese, but when the Japanese conquered Burma, British Raj forces kind of did a scorched earth policy that would, destroy the land where the crops would be cultivated. And not only that, but Japanese bombings and raids also made that worse. So that was actually one of the main reasons why that famine happened. But I don't know what famine he's talking about, so I can't really talk much.
The trouble is that the people have been ground down till they are too poor to buy it. The British had no interest in provisioning for Indian lives. Famine non-intervention was official government policy. How ironic, given that heavy-handed British intervention and market manipulation is what sparked the famines in the first place. And when good people, Indians and foreigners, worked together to help famine-affected peasants, the British government made efforts to stop them. They were furious that the government's own failures were being highlighted. Don't believe me? Listen to this British officer in his own words. Scores of corpses were tumbled into old wells because the deaths were too numerous for the relatives to perform funeral rites. Mothers sold their children for a single meal. Husbands flung their wives into ponds to escape the torment of seeing them perish from hunger. But amid these scenes of death, the British government in India was unmoved. Newspapers were persuaded into silence. Strict orders were given to civilians. Do not acknowledge that civilians are dying of hunger. And if you think that Indians would have done
But which famine was this? I mean, this is actually quite sad. But which famine? Like, I need to know more details here.
worse job, consider this. There hasn't been a single large-scale Indian famine in the 70-plus years since British rule ended. Not one. Independent India has its flaws, but it has been overwhelmingly better at providing for the care, safety, and prosperity of its own people.
Well, yeah, because, the modern Indians... What the hell? Uh-oh. I can see the Chinese bots coming. Look at the border in the north. I don't have Chinese bots in my channel, though. Only Turkish bots. But, yeah, of course, there wouldn't be no famine in India. One, there's no war. Two, Britain, like, the modern Indian state is, based in the Indian subcontinent. So, of course, it'll be able to take the wealth generated and, reinvest into the Indian subcontinent, because that's where it's based in. Duh. It's like what I was talking about earlier in the video. There's no need to siphon the wealth off. Why would you do that? So duh, of course that wouldn't happen. But I mean, he said a lot of things that were true that I'm not going to deny. But there's a lot of things that he said that also was like, what are you talking about? So if you like what I have to say, and you're new to my channel, make sure you subscribe. Make sure to like the video. Go check out my other reactions on my channel. If you have any suggestions like this one, you can comment it. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.